Hello. A few months ago I upgraded from a PC to a 5K retina iMac. And here it is. We have an i9, 40GB of RAM, a Vega Pro 48, a 1TB SSD, and I also got the number pad on the keyboard because of Blender. And of course it has that beautiful 5K retina display too. I bought the iMac with 8GB of RAM and then later upgraded it to 40. Happily, the iMac, you can still add RAM into it. I know that's not always a given with some of the new Apple computers, but with the iMac it's still possible. And in fact, even though Apple will only sell you up to 64GB of RAM, if you're prepared to put your own RAM in, you can go up to 128GB, which is a nice boost over the stock 64. Now this iMac is pretty much top of the range, and it is priced accordingly. It was over £3,500. But then again, I am doing a lot of work which requires this power, video editing, and in particular, Blender. Blender can bring a supercomputer to its knees, so even though this computer is well spec'd out, it's still, it can get slow by Blender. But we'll come on to Blender a bit later. Now, even though £3,500 is still a lot of money, it's actually £1,500 cheaper than the entry-level iMac Pro. And if you don't need the professional features that the iMac Pro has, such as the better cooling, the 10GB Ethernet, the Xeon, the ECC RAM, then you can save a bunch of money and just get this top-of-the-range iMac. Initially, I was actually planning on getting an iMac Pro, but that was before this i9 refresh. The reason behind this was that the previous generation iMac with the quad-core i7 and no Vega GPU just wasn't powerful enough for what I needed, and I figured I'd just save and get a computer that was actually powerful enough for what I wanted. But happily, the i9 refresh came around and allowed me to save over £1,000. The price didn't increase that much between this version and the last version, so because of the inclusion of the i9, I think this latest generation of iMacs actually ends up being better value for money than the previous i7 generation. Onto some other specs for the iMac, and looking at the speakers, well, listening to the speakers, they're actually not too bad for a built-in display. Of course, they're not as good as a pair of high-quality external sort of studio monitor type speakers, but unless you're doing any professional audio, you can probably get away with using the built-in speakers. I haven't got any external speakers yet because I'm pretty happy with the sound quality coming from the iMac itself, and I do have some headphones if I need a little bit more quality and control. And then we have the centerpiece of the iMac experience, that amazing 5K retina display. It's actually made by LG, so it's an LG IPS panel, and you can get it if you buy a 5K ultrafine LG display. It's exactly the same panel, which is good if you need a second display for your iMac. It's a very accurate display, it's very nice to look at, it's very high resolution, so it's very good for video editing, for photo editing, computer-aided design, or really any type of graphics type work. Aesthetically speaking, it's exactly the same as the previous generation iMac. The body looks identical. I know the bezels can look a little bit big in today's bezel-less world, but personally I think it kind of works as part of the overall design. I'm not saying a smaller bezel refresh wouldn't be appreciated, but it doesn't bother me too much. I still think the iMac has a nice, modern, minimalist look. That's not to say that this refresh hasn't been a significant update. Double the cores, nearly double the performance. DaVinci Resolve runs amazingly, the renders are super quick and I never have to wait for anything. Stabilizing footage works well and the playback never stutters. I've tried 4K footage and I've tried playing back footage at 16 times speed, handles it no problem. Substance Painter is also really good, baking maps happens basically instantly, and the viewport is nice and responsive too, even when you have several different materials on a model. And now we move on to one of the other programs I use a lot, and that is Blender, and we actually have a bit of a problem here, although it's not the iMac's fault. Now, the graphics part of Blender uses OpenCL. If you're using a Windows computer or a Linux computer, that's fine because they have OpenCL. OS X also has OpenCL, but Apple have recently introduced Metal. Well, they introduced it about a year or two ago. If you're using Blender 2.79 or earlier, it will run absolutely fine on a Mac. However, Blender 2.8 requires OpenCL 2. Whereas Apple computers, they stopped getting OpenCL support after version 1.4 because Apple has moved over to Metal. It seems very unlikely that Apple is suddenly going to rejuvenate the support for OpenCL 2, so that's not going to work. So really the only way I can see Blender 2.8 working properly with Mac graphics cards is if that supports Metal. Now that's perfectly possible and it is doable, but because Blender is a free program written by, I'm sure they do hire some developers for the Blender Foundation, but it doesn't have the largest budget, certainly not compared to Maya or 3ds Max, so you could be waiting around a long time for Metal support to come, if it ever does. To get around this though, you can boot camp your Mac so it runs Windows, and that solves all the problems because Windows has version 2 of OpenCL. It's a bit of a pain and a shame you just can't use it all in Mac because you have to switch around between operating systems, but it's better than nothing. Basically any other 3D program you're likely to be using, like Maya, 3ds Max, Cinema 4D, they all work fine. And with Blender 2.8 you can still use it, you just can't do anything with the GPU, so you can't GPU render, which makes Eevee or the Workbench engine pretty much useless because they're so GPU based. The i9 is powerful enough to do a lot, but it is a shame to have that Vega 48 GPU sitting inside the iMac completely unused whilst you're using Blender. I don't really play any games on the iMac, perhaps if I decide to boot camp it for Blender, then I might play GTA 5 or some other PC games, but in general, iMacs are not the computer you buy for gaming. I guess they're alright for a little bit of stuff on the side, but if gaming is important to you, the iMac is not the way to go. To be fair though, with an i9 and a Vega Pro 48, it should actually play most games pretty well. I imagine you can play pretty much any modern game at whatever settings you like in 1080p resolution, in 4K, you're gonna have to turn some things down a bit, but if you just want a little bit of casual fun, the iMac has enough power for you. In terms of noise, in general, the iMac is completely silent. If you're doing intensive rendering, say a DaVinci Resolve or a Blender CPU render, then you'll start to hear the fans spool up a bit. It is an audible noise. It's not too annoying and it's definitely not the loudest I've heard, but you will definitely hear it, especially because it's not on constantly. Now the cooling system does bring me to another drawback of the i9 refresh. See, the cooling system is, I believe, the same as how it was in the i7. And you can't just stick a much beefier, much more aggressive CPU inside a computer and not upgrade the cooling. So yes, you will have some issues with thermal throttling if you hit the iMac with a consistent 100% load. This is one of the advantages of the iMac Pro with its Xeon and its much upgraded cooling system. Not to mention the lack of thermal throttling, it's also much quieter, and I've heard people using the iMac have basically never heard the fans at any audible level, which is very impressive. But unless you have the budget to spring for an iMac Pro, you're gonna be a bit stuck knowing that your i9 is just slightly held back by the cooling system, which is a shame, but if you're doing like quick bursts of intensive CPU activity, that's fine. It's just heavy sustained loads. For me, this isn't too much of an issue because my workflow really only requires intense CPU usage if I'm doing a simulation in Blender, which is single threaded, so I'm less likely to hit the thermal limitations of the cooling, or for DaVinci Resolve, but DaVinci Resolve is pretty happy because that has the 48 Pro to do a lot of the processing on. That's one of the good things about the integration and partnership between Blackmagic Design and Apple. DaVinci Resolve is very well optimized for Apple computers. So, who is this refreshed iMac for? Well, if you want a computer for photography, I wouldn't get the i9 and the Vega 48 Pro because that seems a bit overkill. Come a bit down on the specs, but the iMac in general, great computer for photography because of the display. Enthusiast or professional use for video editing and CGI, I think the iMac is pretty good for that, unless you want the modularity and the customizability of a Mac Mini or a Mac Pro. Now, if you're doing really intensive work, like you're editing 8K red RAW files, or you're doing a CGI motion picture, then an iMac Pro is the way to go, because it has the option for the 18-core Xeon, the faster graphics cards and a better cooling, or the new iMac Pro that hasn't yet been released, but that's going to have an insane number of cores and GPU options like the iMac Pro. But for pretty much anyone who's doing a normal workload for video editing or for stuff like that, I think this i9 refresh retina iMac is a very good computer and definitely worth considering. If you found this review helpful, please consider leaving a like and subscribing so as not to miss any new videos. See you later.